Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I'm starting this a little bit early, just to see how many viewers we have and who's logged on. So this is the second week of data analysis using SigmaPlot for biomedicine. And if you have any questions about the material that you've seen the last 2 weeks, then feel free to post questions through the Google Hangout, and I'll attempt to answer those questions. I'll also give you a brief demonstration of how to use the module for those of you that might not have tried it yet, and we'll go from there. Okay, so this is SigmaPlot, and this is some of the data from the second week of the module. And this is here we go. And this is the view of the module itself. So for those of you that haven't used it before, this is the landing page. So when you log into Keats, you'll find data analysis for biomedicine using SigmaPlot here, and then you click, and this is the landing page. So here's your week 1 content, and here's your week 2 content. Now, as I've said in previous weeks, the first week's content is deliberately easy, and some of you might find it a little patronizing, and I just would encourage you to do it quickly and then move on to the second week's content as soon as possible. And this is where we teach you how to analyze data with an unpaired or a paired t-test, and also how to draw the graphs that would be appropriate for unpaired experimental designs or paired experimental designs. Then as we go through into week 3, week 4 and week 5, the types of analyses that you do get more and more complicated. And then finally, in the last week, you'll learn about the chi-squared test and how to avoid doing data analysis and statistical analysis badly. So if you click here, this is where you get to the second week's content, and you can see it's arranged down the left here. This is the table of contents. And if you click on the first page, then you'll see a short introduction from Pratish Thakur, who's one of our graduate teaching studentships at King's. So for those of you that haven't used this before, the navigation tools are here, these little blue arrows to go backwards and forwards. And then usually below each movie, there'll be some information below that you can read that adds to the movie that you'll see. So if you click on the second week, the second week's content on the second page, you'll see that there's a particular experimental design that you're introduced to in this module. And in this case, it's you have to imagine that you measured how quickly 12 male mice and 12 female mice could grasp and eat a sugar pellet. And their response times were measured in seconds. Each mouse was assessed only once. So there'll be some questions for you to answer. So for example, here it will ask you what factor being studied might partially predict response time. And for those of you that have done this before, you should see pretty easily that the factor that's being studied in this experiment that might partially predict response time is the sex or the gender of the animals. So you have 12 male mice and 12 female mice, and you're interested to see whether they differ in their reaction times. And so when you start the quiz down here, it would test you on whether you were able to extract those relevant pieces of information from the experimental design and then choose an appropriate test to analyze it with. Then in the third page, you get a brief YouTube video, about 3 minutes long, which shows you how to draw a histogram of this data. And so if you click on the play button here and the expand button, you can see the content. And I'll just let you watch this for a couple of seconds. Okay, so you can see the point and clicks that the narrator is making, and he shows you how to plot a histogram of that data. And then later on, he'll show you how to plot a bar chart of your data. So that would be in page 5 here. Then when you get to page 6, it will show you how to run the t-test for this particular set of data. And so you click here, you get the short movie for 2 minutes, which shows you how to run the t-test. And then you can do it for yourself. So you can download the data set here and open it in SigmaPlot and have a go for yourself. So what you would do is you'd right-click data set, you'd save the link somewhere on your desktop. For example, here I'm just going to save it on my desktop. And then you would open it in SigmaPlot. And so that's what I've done here. So you can see this would be the example 1 data that we were just looking at. And this is where you'd learn, you could then have a go at analyzing it, plotting a histogram. You put in your source data, you click next and finish, and you get the same histogram that had been shown you in that movie. So as you go along, you can make sure that you've understood what has been said in the movies and that you can generate the same results. We've also provided you with a chapter from a book called The Design and Statistical Analysis of Animal Experiments by Simon Bate. And it's a really useful book. Chapter 5 is probably the most useful, and you can download it here and read it. It is more technical than the information that you'll find in the online module. It's designed to supplement your knowledge, and it's the sort of resource that you might use for years in a career in science. So perhaps the first time you read it, you might only get a small fraction in understanding, but then as you read it again and again over the years, you'll find you absorb more and more of it, and it will become a really useful resource for you. So this is where you learn how to run the unpaired t-test and how to interpret the results. Then in the next page, page 7, we say what a p-value isn't. P-values are a little counterintuitive, and you have to struggle a little bit to understand what they mean. And you won't be alone. I would say that many students and many staff members struggle with the concept of a p-value. It's not at all intuitive. So we've given you some information on what a p-value is and what it isn't. And then there are some links here to a different website by a guy called Alex Reinhardt, which is a little amusing, and it will show you the same information a different way that might help you remember what a p-value is and isn't. We've also given you a small section on the different types of error bar that you might encounter in a scientific career. You've probably heard of standard deviations or standard errors of the mean and confidence intervals. And what we've done now is to provide you with a small article by Jeff Cumming, which explains how you can calculate these and when you should use them in, for example, a report. So I'd recommend that you download and read this. So that's the first half of the content for week 2. Then in the second half, you now encounter the paired t-test instead of the unpaired t-test. And again, Pratish will give you a brief introduction to what this is, and then you go to the section on experimental design. So in this case, you'll learn about an example where men and women are given scores depending on how well they performed on a test of cognition, which is given to them before and then also after a week of brain training education. So the same people here have been assessed before and then after an intervention, and they had the same thing measured before and after. So this is an example of a repeated measures design, and this would be very suitable for analysis using a paired t-test. So again, there'll be a little quiz to check to see if you are able to analyze this experiment to figure out how many levels each factor has and whether it's a repeated measures design or not. And then you get tested on your ability to use the advisor wizard handout, which we've provided you with in a previous week. Again, then the rule of thumb of data analysis, first of all, plot your data using a histogram, which you'll learn in this video. And then in the second video on page 14, you'll learn to plot a line graph. And this is an example of a line graph where you have a mean and some error bars above and below, and you can see that this group of people appear to have improved their cognitive scores after this education with brain training versus before. And so what you'll learn to do in the next page is how to analyze this data using a paired t-test, and then how to interpret the results that you get. So you can analyze this kind of data using a paired t-test, and you'll discover you could also have analyzed it using a thing called the Wilcoxon signed rank test. And it doesn't matter if you haven't heard of these tests before, because the online module will explain to you when one or other test is suitable for this kind of data. And I would say most importantly, SigmaPlot's really helpful. So you will attempt to analyze a particular data set and you'll say, I'd like to try and analyze this with a paired t-test. And sometimes it will say, yep, that's appropriate. And other times it will say, maybe you should consider using this alternative test, the Wilcoxon signed rank test. So SigmaPlot will help you try to make the right decision based on the data that you have. And then at the end of this week's module, you open a new data set. In this case, you'll open the same file, but you'll open example 16 within that data set, and I'll show you where that is now. So if you go back, example 16 is down here. You'd open the data, and you would try to analyze this data set using the skills which we've taught you in this module so far. So again, you'll be able to check to see whether you've absorbed the information in this module for this week through this test. Actually, in this case, there's two examples. There's example 16 and example 17. So you actually get a lot of opportunity to practice with these data sets. So I thought I'd just check back in with you now and see if there's any viewers that have questions based on either last week or this week's module. If you have any questions, feel free to share them through the question and answer option in Google Hangouts. And if not, then I will draw this Google Hangout to a close. Remember, you can ask questions at any time through the week 2 or week 1 forum, and we'll attempt to answer your questions as quickly as you pose them. Now, bear in mind that each week the content gets a little bit more tricky, so I'd encourage you to complete this week's information before moving on to the next week. And in week 3, the content will be as follows. So in week 3, you're going to learn a little bit more about some of these additional tests that you can use to analyze data where you've got one factor, for example, gender with 2 levels, male or female. So you're going to learn some additional tests that are suitable for those kinds of experimental designs. And then in week 4, you're going to learn how to analyze data using a one-way analysis of variance or the Kruskal-Wallis test. And these are suitable where you have experiments with one factor and more than 2 levels, for example, 3 or 4 or 5 levels. Then in week 5, you'll learn how to analyze data using a one-way repeated measures analysis of variance, and also some more complex types of analysis where you might use two-way analysis of variance and two-way repeated measures ANOVA. And then, as I've mentioned before, in the final week, you'll learn to use the chi-squared test, and you'll learn how to avoid doing bad statistics. So that's all that I have to bring up in this Google Hangout this week, and I hope you enjoy working with this online module. Thanks for your attention, and good luck next week.